Today's guest has spent decades in conflict zones and disaster areas around the world, and he's one of the few people to have visited every country on Earth, sometimes traveling with Young Pioneer Tours. Andrew MacLeod is a humanitarian lawyer, former aid worker, and author. Let's dive in on this episode of the Young Pioneer Podcast.
조선중앙 방송입니다.
Welcome to the Young Pioneer Podcast. Today's guest is someone whose life story spans war zones, humanitarian disasters, boardrooms, and every corner of the globe. Andrew Michael MacLeod is an Australian-British humanitarian lawyer, businessman, author, and former United Nations aid official who has spent decades working in some of the world's most difficult environments. He's also one of the very small number of people on Earth, fewer than 500, who has visited every country in the world. In a recent essay reflecting on that milestone, he wrote about everything from standing in a genocide site in Rwanda to witnessing the extreme information control inside North Korea, to meeting children in Tuvalu preparing for the possibility that their island nation could disappear beneath rising seas. Andrew, welcome to the Young Pioneer Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So you visited every country in the world, something fewer than 500 people have done. But before we jump into that, could you just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and the experiences that shaped you early on? What inspired and prepared you for the breadth of travel and work that you've undertaken around the world?
I'm an Australian, so that gives me an enormous amount of privilege merely from the country of my birth and the education that I had access to. But what really shaped me was when I was 20 years old. I was working as a dishwasher on the tropical islands in Queensland and got a call from my mother out of the blue saying they found a brain tumour. Don't come rushing back. They're operating tonight. Call in the morning and find out if I'm still alive. And I rang in the morning and she survived the operation, but the tumour's roots had gone right down to the brain stem, so it was inoperable and she had only a limited amount of time to live. So I quit my job, went back and nursed her a bit while she died. And that gave me a sense of what I call the day before you die test. That if someone says you're going to die tomorrow, which is essentially what happened to my mother, how do you value your life? And for me, I value my life by, have I done more good than harm? But how do you put that into place? I was sitting in second-year law lecture after Mum died, and a guy named Michael Tate, who was our Federal Minister for Justice and a senator from Tasmania, was giving a lecture on constitutional law. And halfway through, he stopped and he said, I don't want to talk about constitutional law. I want to talk about having a law degree. And he said, having a law degree doesn't grant you a happy life and a wealthy existence. It imposes upon you an obligation to use your skills for the betterment of other people. And that just resonated for me. And I thought, if you can use your skills for the betterment of other people, how do I do that? You can do it locally, you can do it in your town, your city, your state, your country, you can do it globally. And I'm a little bit of a narcissist, so I thought I can save the world. Therefore, I have to. So how do you save the world? Well, I like to say you don't make the world better by dealing with good people and keeping them good. You make the world better by dealing with bad people and making them less bad. So I made the decision there and then in that lecture that I wanted to go and work for the High Commission for Refugees or the International Committee for the Red Cross. And I had the good fortune of working for both those organisations in my career. I'd add to that, when I was about 15, my father asked me, what did I want to do in life? And I said, I wanted to visit every country in the world. And he said, oh, that's a bit arrogant. And I said, I don't think it is, Dad. I want to learn about other people's cultures, other people's histories, other people's places. So in the back of my mind, it's always been, I wanted to achieve that life objective, not to rush in, take an Instagram photo and rush out, or as some people foolishly do, land at an airport, claim they've visited a country and then leave. You know, you've got to visit properly. You've got to meet people. You've got to learn something about the history and the culture of the place. That's the critical thing. You've got to learn something while you're there. So I always had in the back of my mind, I wanted to visit every country in the world. My work took me to some of the hardest places to get to and some of the worst places to get to. But it's also been absolutely astonishing because I remember in the early 1990s, I thought, which will be the last country I visit? And I thought, oh, that'll be Albania because it's a closed country. But of course, now Albania is open up and a
much different
wonder for tourism.
Much different place at that time.
That's right.
North Korea of Europe.
Yeah. And then I thought maybe it's going to be Saudi Arabia. And now I find myself working in Saudi Arabia. So, over the 30 or 40 years of travel that I've had, the world has changed and continues to do so. So one of the things that's the challenge is, well, which countries do you go back to? Is it the ones you like the most, or is it the ones that have changed the most? So it's a really interesting, privileged dilemma. I'll say one last thing as part of an introduction, which I'll come back to a few times, and that's this. I recognise as a middle-aged white man brought in Australia, I have an enormous amount of privilege. But I like to say, never feel guilty about your privilege. Only feel guilty if you do nothing with it.
Absolutely, and we're going to touch more on that. So up until that point that you had this experience with your mother and revelation that you wanted to do more, how traveled were you up until that point?
Not at all. I didn't leave Australia for the first time till I was 26. I didn't come from a poor background, but I didn't come from a wealthy background. I came from somewhere in the middle. My mother, before she died, only travelled outside of Australia twice. So, when I decided I wanted to visit every country in the world when I was 15, I'd only been in Australia. When I heard Michael Tate speak when I was in second year law, I'd still only been in Australia. And I didn't get to leave Australia for the first time till I was 26 years old when I was looking for the work with the High Commission for Refugees and the Red Cross.
Okay. And where did that bring you first?
Well, strangely enough, my very, very first trip outside of Australia, other than transit, was to Moscow in 1992. Now, I say transit because I had a transit through Thailand and through London on the way. But I wanted to go to Russia first because when I was at university from 1988 to 1992, that was, of course, when the Soviet Union existed, and I was doing my military training then as well. So we trained against the Soviet Union. So we learned that the Soviet Union was the enemy. And what I tend to do when someone tells me something about someone, I want to check if it's true. So I wanted to see what was wrong with all these Russian people. So I was the vice president of the student union at the University of Tasmania and started a negotiation with Moscow State University to do a student exchange. And we were negotiating through 1989, 1990, 91. And as the Berlin Wall came down and the East started to open up and then the Soviet Union collapsed, suddenly everyone I was negotiating with had vanished and moved to Western Europe. So I sent a telex, what the telexes were in the olden days, before internet, before email, to one of the families in Russia that had agreed to host their families who were going to be visiting. I said, can I come too? Can I come anyway? And they texted back and said yes. And it turned out the wife of the house was a woman named Fatima Gasanova, and she was the head of the Russian Language Institute at Moscow State University. And the husband of the house was a guy named Saidom Gasanov, who had just retired as the head doctor of the Soviet space program and the Soviet Olympic team. So I got to stay at their place. And because Saidom had been in the Soviet space program, he was a personal friend of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. And all their furniture in their apartment was a gift of Yuri Gagarin. So I like to say I slept in Yuri Gagarin's bed. And Saidom just gave me this wonderful tour of Moscow in 1992. And I said to him after about a week, he said, are you enjoying it? I said, oh, yeah, I am, Saidom, but you're mid-60s and male and I'm mid-20s and male. How about we find a girl? So we turned up to Moscow State University and sat in on a law lecture. And in the back row was one of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in my life. And I leaned across and said, do you speak English? And she said, oh, just a little bit. And we got chatting. And we're still friends to this day.
Do you want to elaborate any more? Was there a date? Was there romance?
Well, we went out and hung a week or so with Vika and her horrifically nice boyfriend, Dimitri, which was awfully disappointing because Dimitri and I had a lot in common. And it's just like, well, I can't cut your lunch, mate, because you're a nice bloke. And Vika was super intelligent. And she ended up becoming a partner of competition law, European competition law in a Russian law firm, raised a couple of wonderful daughters, has had a very, very good life. And I think that was really interesting because some of your younger listeners might not realise keeping in touch with someone who you met in Moscow in 1992, before the internet, before Facebook, before email, we had to write letters. And we wrote letters and we kept in touch and watched as our lives evolved, and she got married and had kids and went up the career path of law firms. I did my work as a lawyer for a while before going over to the aid industry. And it reminds me of another thing that I think of. After having visited so many countries and met so many people, I like the phrase, everyone in the world wants the same thing. They want a better future for their children. They just have a different definition of the word better. And going out and learning their definition of the word better is completely empowering. And when I now look at some of the strongest and longest held friendships I have, a fellow lawyer from Russia, a general in Pakistan, a young girl I've been helping in Philippines, a wonderful Irish bloke who's married to a Sicilian that I met in London, some people back in Australia who I've known for a long time. The network and diversity of friendships is incredibly powerful. And if you discipline yourself to meet people from different cultures and places, not to teach them how you do it, but to learn how they do it, then you can have an incredibly fulfilling and empowering life through those friendships.
Absolutely. And so that was 1992. And then your final country was Sudan, and that was 2025, correct?
Yep, in December 2025.
December 2025.
It just counts as a visit. It's a little bit disappointing because we went to Port Sudan with Young Pioneers Tours, spent a few days there and ticked what I would call the minimum boxes of meeting people, learning something. And I have a very, very good friend I worked with in the UN who's Sudanese, and her brother just happened to be in Port Sudan at the time. So I, as well as doing the YPT bit, I vanished for a while and spent some time with Rania's brother and got to meet some local people as well. But Sudan is a country of 50,000 years of human history, the Nubian pyramids, the romance of Khartoum, and all of these places where you can't visit at the moment because of the conflict. And, I'll definitely go back to Sudan to do what I would call a proper visit. But I would like to reflect upon one other thing as well. 20 odd years ago, when I was head of early warning and emergency preparedness for the High Commission for Refugees, I wrote an internal document in the UN that I believe was the first internal document that declared Darfur genocide. And to see the killing that is going on still today in Sudan, and yet almost no one protests about it. And what is it that gets people protesting about Gaza, but not protesting about Sudan, where there is more death, more violent death, as if those black people don't matter?
You even wrote about in your essay talking about going to Sudan. You talked about standing in the ruins of the Red Sea diving resort, which was used by Mossad in the 80s to evacuate Ethiopian Jewish refugees. So what was it like when you realized you had reached the final country, but also in that context, the context of that experience at the Red Sea diving resort?
Oh, it's funny. I went through the mental jump of visiting every country in my second last one, actually, because my second last one was Chile, which I visited in about February or March 2025. And back then I was thinking, I just don't know when I'm going to get to Sudan. So in my mind, the journey had been done with an asterisk. I will get to Sudan when I can get to Sudan. And it was an interesting mental jump flying from Chile across the Pacific back to Australia to think, lifetime objective done. So what do you do with it? How do you apply that learning? How do you apply those experiences? How do you share the knowledge and the learning from that? So that was the really interesting thing. Going to the Red Sea resort was also interesting because I'm particularly passionate about geopolitics. So I'm a professor at King's College London now. I've done a lot of things in counterterrorism and conflict zones. And I am a specialist in war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. That's where my master's degree was focused on. So when I talk about genocide, I talk about it from a very legalistic viewpoint. And it is a truism of the world that if the answer seems simple, then it's not the answer. There is such a degree of complexity in international law and international politics. So when you stand in the Red Sea resort, and you're right, that was where Mossad and the Israeli Special Forces used as a base to rescue Jewish people out of Ethiopia. few people realised that it was actually on that raid that Benjamin Netanyahu's older brother died. He was the one who planned that raid and died in that raid. And Benjamin Netanyahu's brother is held up as a bit of a hero in Israel. And one of my pet theories about why Netanyahu does what he does is because he can't escape the shadow of his brother. So when you're standing in a Red Sea resort and you feel the shadow of Netanyahu's brother, you recognise at the same time the enormous amount of injustice that's been done to the Jewish people over the years, but equally the amount of injustice that's been done to the people of Gaza. And the visibility on what's happened to the people in Gaza is in itself an injustice on the people of Sudan.
I have one more question that relates to visiting every country, and then I want to talk about your humanitarian work. So after your visit to Port Sudan, which you've said was just a visit rather than a proper one, as it were, and you wrote in your essay that visiting countries isn't about ticking them off the list. You know, you want to meet people, you have to share experiences, learn across cultures. So what separates meaningful travel from just simply passing through?
Well, are you doing it to boast or are you doing it to learn? I think that's the critical thing. You know, those people who say, you know, I'm 21, 22 and I've visited every single country in the world and I've got a photo of every departure lounge. You know, I'm sorry. I know I should have respect for that, but I don't. You know, travel is not about boasting to other people, about exploiting your privilege. Remember, I said earlier, never feel guilty about your privilege, only feel guilty if you do nothing with it. The next step beyond guilt is absolute shame, that if you rub your privilege into the face of others and you've done nothing with it, I do have a degree of contempt for that. Whereas the guy who was my guide in Socotra called them the Insta idiots. You've got to learn something. You've got to be respectful. You've got to be wowed by something. You know, every culture has something special that does something different that you go, oh, you know, it's interesting that they do it this way. I might apply a bit of that. And if you just rush through a country and scratch the surface and, you know, take a big top bus tour and then leave, like one guy posted on Facebook once, flew into Sydney on Wednesday night, took a big bus tour of Sydney and then flew out Thursday afternoon and counted that as a trip to Australia. That's like, are you mad? You know, are you absolutely stark raving mad that it's disrespectful of the host country, it's disrespectful of the audience that you're putting your photos up to people, but it's also disrespecting yourself. You know, you spend all of this money to go to a country to tick a box, but you don't learn anything. What's the point? You know, you've got to come away with some little tidbit that you go, wow, that's really interesting.
There's some things that Andrew can say that I, as a tour guide, might not exactly be able to say. So,
yeah, I mean, it's not a race, for gosh sake. It's, you know, it's not a competition. It's a learning experience. It's a respectful experience. And it's got two steps. You learn and then you do something with that knowledge. Otherwise, what's the point?
Talking about when you had this revelation when you were in law school, from there you began your humanitarian career working with the International Committee of the Red Cross in the 90s, including in Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide. Yeah. So how does witnessing something like that, soon after you left Australia really for the first time, how does that reshape your understanding of humanity in the world?
It's tough. My working career has let me see the lowest of the lows and the highest of the highs. As a middle-aged white male, I have no shame in saying there are many times I've sat on the floor and burst into tears at sheer frustration and sadness and the sense of injustice that some people go through. I was in a meeting in Rwanda once and I came out with my Swiss colleague and immediately she lit up a cigarette. And a little street kid came running up. He looked about 12 years old, said, "Donnez-moi une cigarette, give me a cigarette." And I looked at the kid and I said, "Très-moi pour la santé, it's very bad for your health." And he took a step back and he put his arms up and he said, "Monsieur, regardez-moi, sir, look at me." And I looked him up and down and he had scabies and skin falling off. And I'm like, "You're right, kid. If you live long enough to get cancer, you're lucky. Here, have a cigarette." And we sat down And we started talking. And I've found in almost every country that I've been to which have street children issues, sitting down with street kids is really empowering of them and of you, because street kids are wise. They know what's happening in the country. And if you treat them with respect, to listen and to learn, your eyes will really open up. And this kid said, as part of our discussion, the problem with you people from rich countries is you think education is a right, and I know it's a privilege. I would do anything to go to school. As it turned out, he was 15. He looked 12 because of his malnourishment and the stunting of growth. When I was in the Philippines, we were doing a program on trying to prevent the spread of sexually transmitted diseases in pregnancy amongst teenage girls. And the number of 13, 14, 15-year-old girls who I met through that work who were prostitutes and who were prostituting themselves so they could pay for their school. I reflected back when I was 12, 13, 14, when I used to come home and say to mum, I hate school, I don't like going to school. If I could go back to my 12, 13-year-old self and slap me in the face and say, no, you've got to understand how empowering this is. And some of these young kids, if they had just 1 scintillionth of the privilege and luck that I have had, they would have done something incredibly powerful with their lives. The truth is they probably would never have got the chance. So I think on the downside, when you go into the worst parts of the world, you see some of the most incredible people who are just never going to get a chance to stand up. But equally, you find some of the most heroic people who have stood up against adversity and done something with themselves. There's an amazing woman named Gordana who ran a small orphanage in a town called Sombor in Vojvodina. And during the war in Yugoslavia, during Operations Flash and Storm near the end of the war, massive amounts of refugees came across the border from the Serb Krajina into Vojvodina in northern Serbia. And Gordana had trained all the local villages in how to receive and register refugees, and built a summer camp with them by smuggling local art out of Serbia into Switzerland, auctioning it off, and then smuggling the money back into Serbia to build a summer camp for orphans. And whenever I felt a little bit down, I'd go up to Sombor and I'd talk to Gordana, and I'd be filled with her energy and her enthusiasm. But then you can also see some of the results that you do. In the law of armed conflict work I was doing in Rwanda, it was post-genocide, but before Rwanda invaded Congo. And we were implementing a law of armed conflict training program that had a measurable decrease in civilian casualties from 800 a week to 400 a week. And you sit there and you go, okay, our work has just saved 400 people's lives every week. And in Yugoslavia, in my spare time, I used to be a competitive swimmer, so I swam with the Yugoslav national swim team. And we created a water rescue program that's still running today, that's saving people in the rivers, lakes and beaches of Yugoslavia. So it's a funny thing. You get real lows like the kids in Rwanda or some of the kids in the Philippines, and then you get real highs when you see some heroes really standing up. And I think one of the greatest frustrations, which is a frustration you can do nothing about, when you go home to your own country, in my case, Australia, and you see this enormous privilege that everyone has and how much they take it for granted. And you've got to let them take it for granted. When young people approach me and ask for guidance on how to become an aid worker or what have you, I say, you've got to remember something. The moment you become an aid worker and you go to a conflict or disaster zone, you'll create a permanent division between you on one hand and your family and friends on the other. In Rwanda, I stood in a church in Yatarama with 3,500 rotting human corpses at my feet, the smell of which never leaves me. And I can explain that like I've just explained it now, but I can't make you feel it. And I don't want you to feel it. It's not a nice feeling to have as part of your body that even talking about it now, I get emotional. So you have life experiences that your family and friends will never have, and that differentiates you from them. And that becomes saddening and frustrating until you accept it. That part of your life can only be shared with people who have gone through something similar.
And did you ever flinch or hesitate when you found out you were going to be sent to any of these conflict zones like Rwanda or Bosnia during the breakup of Yugoslavia?
No, I flinched when I might have to go home. Repatriating home is much harder than expatriating overseas. I was mentoring a young girl in Dubai once. She was from India and she was a waitress. And she asked me, "Why are you helping me? I'm very different from you." And I said, "No, you're not. The mere fact that you've packed up your life and moved to another country just to make yourself better, that puts you in the top, 1% of people on the planet. You've become part of a global expatriate community that links you. The people you're different with are the people who have never left home. And by definition, your families and friends who stayed home haven't had those experiences, haven't had those intercultural challenges. And that does make you different. I'm not saying better or worse, but it makes you different. And when going home, you realize that you're going back to a whole bunch of people who never left. So you have to box up those experiences. So I have more in common with that Indian waitress in Dubai than I do with my friends in Australia who never left because they never left."
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will also understand that feeling. And I want to move on to some of your disaster response work. So from 2005 to 2008, you spent more than 2 years in Pakistan coordinating the humanitarian response to the Kashmir earthquake. It was one of the deadliest disasters in modern South Asian history. And you worked closely with General Nadim Ahmed, who was coordinating the military and civilian reconstruction effort. And you, in your essay, you described him as a big brother figure during that time. So what did that situation and disaster response work at that scale in general look like behind the scenes? You've got to form personal relationships with soldiers, aid workers, government officials. Yeah, tell us more.
Well, firstly, I'll say I wouldn't describe General Nadim as a big brother at the time. I'd describe him as a big brother even now. Now, the last time I spoke with Nadim was last week, 20 years later. And I'll jump forward in time to something I'm sure we'll touch on a bit later. I'm fostering a child out of the Philippines at the moment. There's a long, complicated story about it. And when I was telling General Nadim about that, his first response was, "I'm looking forward to meeting my Filipino niece." And, no question, no doubt, if she's my daughter and he's my brother, therefore she's my niece. And Pakistanis, to a fault, once they've accepted you, they forget you're a foreigner. And they are the most loving, wonderful, kind people. And the experiences that I had in Pakistan will never leave me. It's a magnificent country. It's geographically spectacular. It's got its political challenges for sure. But the Pakistani people have a wonderful heart. And in life, I have what I call how the heck did I get here moments, but I use another word other than heck, ends in K, but starts with F. And, flying through the Himalayas in a helicopter piloted by the Vice Chief of General Staff of the Pakistan Army, and you think, how did a little boy from Australia get here? How the heck did I get here? The bonds you build when you're going through disasters are very strong bonds. But again, it goes back to something I said earlier, that all people are the same. They just want a better future for their children. Suddenly you scrape away the superficial differences, as well as some substantive differences. He's an army general in Pakistan from an Islamic country. I'm a white guy from Australia, from a nominally Christian country, but an atheist. And we create a strong bond because we respect each other as human beings and respect each other at what we were able to do at the time. And I'll pick you up on something you said earlier. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in South Asia. The truth about natural disasters is their scale isn't measured by dead people because, to be honest, dead people don't need help. The scale of a natural disaster is measured by the number of people who survive. And to put things in perspective, the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004 killed about 200,000 people and injured about 100,000. But the terrain was relatively warm and relatively flat because a tsunami only impacts people a certain distance from the coast. The Pakistan earthquake killed 76,000 people, which is fewer than the tsunami, but it injured a couple of 100,000. It made 3.5 million people homeless in a Himalayan terrain 6 weeks before winter was about to dump 20 feet of snow on top of everyone. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, the hardest and largest natural disaster catastrophe to hit the planet. It got very little coverage for its size for two reasons. One, because it was Pakistan and people couldn't empathize with a remote village in the Himalayas, whereas compared to the tsunami, people could empathize with someone sitting on a beach in Thailand. But the other reason it didn't get much coverage is because it worked. You know, the tsunami response was deeply flawed and failed in all sorts of ways, but the Pakistan earthquake response worked incredibly well, principally because of the Pakistan Army people. In natural disaster response, you have what we call a 70-20-10 rule. In any natural disaster, 70% of the response is done by local people themselves, 20% is done by national governments, and about 10% is done by international support. But the perception is 70% is done by international support, 20% by local government, and 10% is done by the local people, as if the local people sitting down going, woe is me, woe is me. You know, a natural disaster hits, and what happens? Neighbours stand up, they help each other, they dig people out from rubble, they give people homes, they share food. And one of the most uplifting times in my life was Christmas Day 2025. I was up in a place called Musafirabad, huddling around a little heater in a tent. The relief effort had been going since October. And one of the soldiers came in and woke me up and said, Mr. Andrew, there are people outside who need to talk to you. I'm like, oh, I better go out and see what's wrong. And there was a whole line of people from the local town who had lost everything as the earthquake had destroyed their houses. But they were bearing gifts. And they were saying to our foreign friends, to our Christian friends, you should be at home with your families today on this special day, but here you are helping us. Thank you. And gave a gift. People whose houses had been destroyed, who in many cases had lost a family member, were so compassionate towards us because we were away from our families that they had to make the statement and give a gift. It's just, the power of humanity is astonishing.
I mean, you're touching on some of this here, but you've been openly critical, though, of the humanitarian aid industry itself.
Yeah.
So
very much.
We were going to say it bluntly. What's the biggest structural problem with the global aid sector today?
The failure to crack down on the pedophilia and the abuse of women and children by UN and NGO staff. That's the largest structural problem. It's a cancer at the very core. And for your listeners who don't believe it, just Google. It's a strange thing to Google, Andrew MacLeod, United Nations sex abuse, and see what comes up, or just Google sex abuse in the aid industry and come up. In the mid-1990s, there was a scandal called the whistleblower scandal where UN security staff had trafficked 14, 15-year-old girls out of Moldova into Bosnia, chained them up in a nightclub called Florida 2000 for the exclusive use of UN staff. That is so well known. It's been turned into a movie called Whistleblower starring Rachel Weisz. So if people doubt me, just have a look at the movie and realize that's the stuff that the lawyers allowed to go into the script. Then there was a scandal in the early 2000s called the Food for Sex scandals, where during the wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in some cases, families were only allowed into refugee camps if they handed over a child for sexual favours. I know that to be a fact because at the time I was head of early warning and emergency preparedness for the High Commission for Refugees, and I saw our internal documents. In the Ebola crisis in Eastern Congo, WHO, World Health Organization staff were abusing women and children in the middle of an Ebola crisis, a crisis which is spread by bodily fluids, for gosh sake, and the impunity that these people feel. And the truth is that as we crack down on predatory pedophiles in the developed world, we're now super aware of what goes on in schools and kindergartens and scout halls and things like that. The predators who are rat cunning, they go to the next soft target. And the truth is the softest target now is poor people in the developing world. And the easiest way to get access to poor people in the developing world is to join a children's charity. And the moment I say that out loud, people will think two things. One, that's disgusting. And two, that's logical. That's where predators will go. And if you're ever thinking about donating money to a charity, I would say just ask them this question. How many of your former staff are currently in jail for child abuse? And if their answer is 0, that means they're not taking this problem seriously. You want them to be able to say, yes, we are actively weeding them out and we're reporting them, and some of them have gone to jail. If they have not done that, then they're not taking this issue seriously. It is a stain and a curse. In my book, A Life Half Lived, I wrote that one day the UN will be recognised as the second largest harbour of pedophiles next to only the Catholic Church. And I now know I'm wrong. They're bigger. And when people look at me like I'm from Mars or some conspiracy theorist, I say, no, it's just a simple piece of maths. There are more aid workers than there are Catholic priests in more countries than the Catholic Church is present in, with better access to children and controlling food, water and shelter. I don't need to say there's some grand conspiracy. I just need to say there's opportunity to offend. There is no preventative mechanism in place. And if you have opportunity to offend and no preventative mechanism in place, the natural consequence is offending will take place until such time as we stop it.
Well, frankly, I think in light of some recent developments in the Western world, one could argue that there is something of a grand conspiracy in place. And I mean, how do you crack down on that in the humanitarian aid sector if those kinds of abuses exist all the way to the highest level of our supposed Christian Western world leaders?
So the National Crime Agency, or the precursor to the National Crime Agency in the UK, came out with a statement about 20 years ago estimating that the prevalence of pedophilic attraction in men is about 1 in 35, about 3%. And it's a number that makes sense to me. And if you start from the viewpoint, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, Christian or non-Christian, east or west, north or south, any group of men, if you start from the assumption that there's going to be somewhere around about 3% that have pedophilic tendencies. Are there pedophiles in the police force? Answer, how many men are there? 3% of that, there's your answer. Are there pedophiles in Parliament? Okay, how many men are there in Parliament? 3%, there's your answer. In the aid industry, there are 500,000 aid workers in the world today. About 300,000 of them are male, 3% of which is 9,000. Is that a safe starting assumption to say there's about 9,000 men with pedophilic tendencies with access to children, controlling food, water and shelter? Yes, that's a safe starting point. We've got to be careful. Just because you have a pedophilic tendency doesn't mean you act upon that attraction. But in all too many cases, it does. So most criminologists will tell you sex crimes are not crimes of sex, they're crimes of power. They tend to be crimes by deeply insecure men who are trying to make themselves feel better by making someone else feel worse. And there is no greater imbalance of power today than that between aid worker and aid beneficiary. When the aid beneficiary is starving and the aid worker controls the food, water and shelter that you and your family are going to have tonight, it creates an horrific power imbalance. And we've got to remember that criminologists will also tell you size of penalty doesn't deter crime. Fear of detection does deter crime. And right now, the fear of detection in the aid industry is 0. So we've got to create a detection mechanism to track people, which then brings me on to some of the other work that I'm now doing. Is I've created, through my role as a visiting professor at King's College in London, a genetics tool that in the small subset of cases of abuse against women and children, so it doesn't include boys for reasons that will become obvious, between the age of puberty and menopause, some of those women and children get pregnant. And when those women or children get pregnant, the resulting child, 50% the father's DNA and 50% the mother's DNA. So I've been running an experiment since 2019, starting in Philippines, now in Kenya, that where children have been born of abuse, we take DNA from the resulting child, isolate the father's side of the DNA, then compare that to publicly available databases like the commercial genealogy sites, map out the paternal family, triangulate backwards to identify the father. And in about 87% of cases, we find the fathers. I then fly to wherever in the world they are, knock on their door and say, I've got 3 bits of good news for you. A, you're a father. B, your child's got a lawyer. And C, I'm your child's lawyer. Sit down, son. We have a few things to talk about. And hearteningly, about 80% of men have immediately taken responsibility, which includes, if the child's still under 18, a child support order, getting children a second nationality, letting the child know their family history, medical history, and starting to, in some cases, build a father-child-like bond. In some cases, one in Australia and one in Canada, one in Britain now. Fathers have tried to fight us, but we've dragged them to court. And it's good that some have tried to fight us, because from a legal standpoint, we need to get the legal precedent that the science is recognised by the courts and the consequences are now recognised by the courts. We've now got to expand this up so that people know that if they go overseas and abuse women and children, either as sex tourists or aid workers or soldiers, if a child is resulting, one day you will be caught. It might not be now, it might not be till your 80th birthday, it might not be till after you die that a knock on the door of your children results in your children finding out a half-brother and a half-sister. And then every member of your family will know you were an abuser.
Okay, I have a lot of questions.
Yep.
But for our listeners, can you just explain why you chose the Philippines and Kenya as a starting place for this DNA genealogy testing to identify fathers of children and sex abuse cases, or even in the case of the Philippines, children abandoned by foreign men who were with prostitutes?
Yeah. Originally, I was wanting to go to the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, but we had some objections from a certain branch of feminism. Now, there's one branch of feminism called misandristic feminism. That is feminism not driven by the protection of women, but driven by the hatred of men. And they're objecting to say that we were re-victimizing the victims because the people holding the tube into which a woman or child would spit to get the DNA result, by being held by a man, that was re-victimizing the victim and they wouldn't want to participate. And my response was, if I go to a poor woman in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo who's got a child they're trying to find a father of, and I say, if you spit in this tube, I might but can't promise, might be able to find the father. And if I find the father, I might but can't promise, but might be able to get a child support order. The grand total number of women who say, no, because I'm feeling victimized by you being male, I think will be close to zero, if not zero. But there's a certain branch of misandristic feminism that blocks things. So while that was being blocked, I was like, oh, well, how can I prove my idea? And right at that time, a newspaper article appeared on my Facebook profile, Daddy, do you ever think of me? Children left behind by sex tourists in the Philippines, in The Guardian, written by a journalist named Margaret Simon. So if you put Margaret Simon's The Guardian, Daddy, do you ever think of me? This newspaper article will pop up.
Could I just ask quickly how were they able to, this particular brand of feminism, posing as progressive but is quite regressive, how were they actually able to successfully block your implementation of this program first? That you had to look at the Philippines to test it?
Yeah. So that first part of the program was going to be done formally through King's College London, and therefore, as an academic study, had to be approved by the Ethics Committee. So they were raising these concerns in the Ethics Committee. They even asked these 2 questions, which were crazy. The 2 questions they asked. Have you put enough thought into the adverse impact on the man when he finds he's a father? And do you think the mothers are adversely incentivized by money? And I responded to them, I am stunned that in the age of Me Too, you are asking me if I am concerned about the mental welfare of the abuser. And secondly, I am stunned that you're asking me if the woman is adversely incentivized by the money that she is ethically, morally, and legally entitled to. Stunned. So while that was all going on, I decided I've got a little charity in Switzerland called Hear Their Cries, hearing the cries of victims and hearing the cries of whistleblowers. Rather than doing it as an academic study through King's College, where I'm a visiting professor, I decided to do it as a Hear Their Cries project separate from King's College, so it didn't need the ethics committee approval. And because Margaret Simon's a wonderful, wonderful woman, wonderful journalist in Australia, she's got her own charity, Angeles Relief Incorporated, which has got deductible gift recipient status. So if any of you want to donate to the Philippines program, Google Margaret Simon's charity, Angeles Relief Incorporated, and I can highly recommend it because she's continuing to grow the program in Philippines. So I contacted her about her newspaper article and I said, these kids mentioned in your article, are you trying to find the fathers? And the answer was yes, but it was hard. Some we knew the names and addresses, but it was difficult. And I told her about my idea about using DNA. It's not yet proven. How about we use my idea, go back to the mothers and the children, get the consent, put the ethical protections around them, and let's see if this works. So we did. And we found the fathers of the children mentioned in her article, plus a whole lot more. So it's including the work that Margaret's done without me. I think we're north of 50 or 55 children in Philippines. We then chose Kenya because there's a British Army base in Kenya in a place called Nanyuki that's been there about 80 or 90 years. And strangely, a lot of paid sex work on the outside of the base, a lot of mixed race children running around on the outside. And for decades, women have been approaching the Ministry of Defence in the UK to say, my child was fathered by a British soldier, and the Ministry of Defence has just poo-pooed them and tapped them off. And under British law, if you descend from a British father, depending on the year you were born, you are automatically a British citizen. So these mixed race children, as well as being in poverty, actually are British citizens and have rights of British citizens that they're unaware of. So we thought, well, let's see if we can find the fathers. And it was easier in Kenya than in Philippines because Philippines, you had no idea where the father was from. It could be from anywhere in the world. Whereas in Kenya, the assumption was the fathers will most likely be British soldiers, and that's turned out to be the case. I think it's 22 or 23 DNA samples we've done now, found 19 fathers. We've gone through courts. We've got court orders against the Ministry of Defence and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs to disclose contact details. And most of the fathers we've contacted now have consented and done declarations of parentage by consent, developing a relationship with the child. If the child's under 18, child support, and asserting and gaining nationality for the children as well. So this can be life-changing. And to give you an idea, the youngest child we took DNA from was 1. The oldest child we took DNA from was 67. And that shows you just how long this problem has been going on for. And even the 60-year-old, obviously not able to meet his father because his father had died, but meeting half-siblings, but even more than that. I thought this work was going to be about child support orders, citizenship and stuff like that. And I missed the major benefit for many of the children. And there was one child, child B, 14 in the Philippines, had a big dimple on her chin, good student, sat hunched over a little bit, very introverted, but a good kid. When I found her father, he had a big dimple on her chin and I showed her the photo and she rubbed her dimple on her chin and then she sat upright, like this weight lifted off her shoulder. And she's like, that's where I get it from. And she said, so if you find this guy as my father, I can now get this other nationality. I said, yes, you can. So I can get out of here. Yes, you can. So I need to study hard at school. Yes, you do. I need to learn good English. Yes, you do. And this has become the single largest empowering factor for this child to finish school with good grades for the ability to break out of the cycle of poverty she's in. Just this sense of identity of who she is.
Can you tell me about the range of reactions that you get? I have to imagine.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's probably not smooth going in most cases, but maybe there have been some that have been cooperative. Just tell us about it.
The first one I contacted lured me into a false sense of security in a sense because he had 2 daughters from another relationship. And when I reached out to him, he had a son in the Philippines. And he said, well, I hope you're not a scammer. I've always wanted a son. And immediately developed a relationship with the child, introduced the child to his 2 half-sisters. And I actually spoke to the child yesterday. So this is 7 years after we found the father. So how's it going? He's like, it's going well. I'm going to the US soon. My dad's getting me my passport. I'm just finishing my school. I talk to my sisters most days. I'm like, could it get better than that? On the other hand, child B, who I was mentioning before, her father is a right royal a-hole. Fights us every step of the way. We've even had to drag him back to court to get him to disclose his birth certificate so we could apply for the child's nationality in Canada. He's a right royal terrible person. And child B said, all I want is my father to accept me and give me a hug. And I've had to say to her, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. But remember, you are a good person. Don't take someone else's failure as a reason to feel bad. The greatest revenge you can have on someone is always success. So build your life into something powerful and good, and that will be your greatest revenge.
In your opinion, what, and without giving away too many details about these people, but what do you think was the motivating factor for your first case where it couldn't have gone better, and then this child B case that you're talking about where the father's fighting you every step of the way?
I think it's very complex. The father of child B, when I first approached him, his first question was to clarify the date. He said, yes, that was before I met my wife. So that was okay. So the cheating bit wouldn't come into it. And I thought he was then going to be decent, but he then wasn't. And I think, like I said before, the motivation behind many cases of abuse is a deep sense of insecurity in the man themselves. And they always felt, the old saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And they had this sense of impunity. And if they'd been confronted by, a female or something like that, maybe they would bluster and bullshit their way out of it. But when a middle-aged white man is confronted by a middle-aged white man, a middle-aged white man says to middle-aged white man, gotcha, son, there's nowhere to hide. And these people are by their nature bullies because they are imposing themselves on someone else. And if you think I'm being a bit harsh, just remember, for pregnancy to result, there had to be the conscious decision of the man to not only place his unprotected penis inside a vagina, but to reach climax. This doesn't happen by accident. You don't trip in the street and whoops, that happened. So there was a thought process. There's a predatorial process that comes up to this. It is an intended consequence that she might get pregnant, and if she does, she will never find me. It's that sense of, I can do this to you. So when I confront them, some of them straight away go mea culpa. One wanted to have a son. Others do a very clear calculation because I say to them, you've got three options. Option A, consent, do it quickly, quietly, cheaply. Option B, fight me, I'll drag you through courts. It'll be expensive. Google Andrew MacLeod, sex abuse, BBC, CNN, and see what I can do to you. Or option C, bury your head in the sand and pretend it's going away, but here I am standing on your front doorstep. So for some, when I confront them as a middle-aged white man confronting another middle-aged white man, but confronting them with the background that I have. And when you Google me, what I bring to this negotiation is you have no idea how bad this can get for you if you don't do the right thing by the child. And my Northern Star is always what is in the best interest of the child. And what's in the best interest of the child is a good collaborative relationship between father and child. So you must give the father, regardless of the circumstances of procreation, you're now dealing with the fact of procreation. So you must give the father every single chance to do the right thing because that's in the best interest of the child. But if the father refuses to do the right thing, then you come at him with every tool in the armory.
Where are you looking at other locales for this program?
Yeah, what I'm now starting to do is have a dialogue with a couple of national governments because we, people like Margaret and I, we can do this out of our own philanthropy because we largely fund it ourselves and we can do 50, 100, 150, 200 kids. There are hundreds of thousands of children in these circumstances. And again, I'll say children is any age. We are all children of somebody. And there's an organisation in Norway called Children Born of War that is still trying to find the genetic heritage of children born in World War II. There are 90-year-olds alive today who are saying the last thing I want to do before I die is find out who I am. And it really is that degree of identity. So whether it's sex tourism in Cambodia, Thailand, Madagascar, Kenya, Philippines, whether it is aid work, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo, whether it's conflict, Sudan, Ukraine, there are going to be children born in these circumstances of abuse who, for the rest of their life, will want to know who they are. And we've got to expand it to a government-to-government program. The only way it can get to a point where as many children as possible who deserve this justice can get this justice. It has to be government to government. So I'm starting a dialogue with governments to see if a government will take it on as an experiment. I'll say one other thing in this context as well, if I may, just before I do, because some of your listeners might be saying, but hang on, the woman consented to this. Why is the man now held to account? Now, put aside whether the woman did consent or not, and whether you think transactional sex is abuse or not. I'm not talking about the rights of the mother. I'm talking about the rights of the child. And it doesn't matter what the mother and father agreed to between themselves. A child was born, and every child has the right to know who their father is, and every child has the right to assert the rights that derive from that paternity.
Some of the governments that you've talked with, how have they received this idea?
It's really complicated. So let's take a child in the Philippines whose father is in Australia. The issues this now touches on, was there a extraterritorial criminal offence that took place? If there was, how do you get the evidence? Do you do an extradition? Which jurisdiction do you follow the criminal proceedings in, Philippines or Australia? The civil application, which is the court system that you assert parentage, is it the Philippines court system or is it the Australian court system? We've got a precedent now. You used to have to commence in the habitual domicile of the child, in this case Philippines, which drags out for years. We've now got a new precedent that we can begin in the habitual domicile of the father, in this case Australia. So that makes things a bit quicker. Once you get a court order, that then goes into the Child Welfare Agency, the Child Support Agency. If you're then applying for the child's nationality, you then go into Foreign Affairs and you then go into Home Affairs. And if the child is abandoned, but the child wants to visit Australia, which we had to do in one case, you then need permission for the child to travel without both parents. How do you get the child their passports without the permission of both parents? A whole series of very complicated administrative and bureaucratic systems come in, many of which are set up for the protection of the child to stop child trafficking. And we've got very unusual circumstances. So you're touching on so many areas of government, not just one government department. So the first hurdle is, how do you get a working group of mid-level bureaucrats across multiple departments that can come up with a coherent response on behalf of the children to then advise the ministers on the legal and administrative changes that need to take place to help these kids? And then how do you do it in a way that doesn't leak into the media, that this then becomes stuck in an anti-immigration, anti-foreigner debate, as opposed to what this debate should be? These children are Australian citizens if their fathers are Australian. They're British citizens if their fathers are British. I had one government agency in the state of Victoria threaten to prosecute me under the Migration Act for giving migration advice without a migration license. And I said to this bureaucrat, you do realise the entire Migration Act only applies to non-citizens. This child is a citizen. I've got the child's citizenship. I've got the passport. It's not a question of migration. So the entire act doesn't apply. But what was going through the head of that bureaucrat, so embarrassed they were that they tried to threaten to prosecute you because you're helping an abandoned child. What was going through that person's head? And that person worked for the Department of Family Fairness and Housing in the government of Victoria. It was supposed to be the agency that was protecting children.
Incredible. And so how did you get through it? How did you push past that?
Because I hate bullies. And this particular person was a bully. And I'm a lawyer. And I just wrote back to them and I said, the entire Migration Act doesn't apply. Piss off.
And that was it?
Yep.
Okay.
I was right.
Yeah.
The Migration Act doesn't apply. Mm-hmm. End of.
I think, you mentioned that this is also part of your criticism of humanitarian aid organizations and that these types of abuses also exist there. Have you approached any of the humanitarian aid organizations that you've worked with about this program?
Yeah. bluster, bullshit, denial, and sweep under the carpet. You know, there's a woman named Jane Connors who was the victims' rights advocate in the Secretary General's office in the UN, 2017, 18, 19, 20, tried to get the UN to do this. Oh, yes, we'll look at it, we'll examine it. And what have they done? Diddly squat. The world's most powerful statistic is the number 0. How many UN staff are currently in jail for abusing women and children? 0. And that's all you need to say, because no one would say abuse doesn't happen. The UN's own website says that it does. When Priti Patel was the Secretary for State for International Development, she went with my assistants, intellectual assistants, to the high-level panel on sexual exploitation and abuse in the wings of the 2017 General Assembly. And she raised this directly with the Secretary General. And the Secretary General responded that, contrary to what's said in the public, the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse is not a problem of peacekeeping. It's a problem of the broader UN system and probably bigger in peacekeeping. Sorry, bigger outside of peacekeeping. So the Secretary General himself then said it. I then went on to CNN as part of the Oxfam scandal. And I called upon the Secretary General to say that they would never use Article 18 and Article 19 of the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities, which gives UN staff immunity, to block prosecutions of UN staff accused of child sex offences. Within 30 minutes, the Secretary General spokesman came on Twitter and said, we will never use that immunity to block it. Yet, how many people have gone to jail? None, when their own website still says multiple hundreds. From the people who have come forward and made an accusation, multiple hundreds of known victims have come forward, yet no one's in jail.
So this is obviously going to be an uphill battle no matter what government you're dealing with, no matter what aid organization you're dealing with, because obviously it to a degree they've got to admit failures of policy, failures of the institution.
Yes.
So how can our listeners, if they want to contribute and support your endeavors, is there a way that they can do that?
There's 3 ways. One is if you're considering donating to any charity that works overseas, always ask them this question: how many of your staff worldwide are currently in jail or being investigated by police, not internal investigations, for child abuse? If the answer is 0, don't donate money, and tell them you're not. Tell them the reason I'm not donating money is because the number 0 is impossible. The number 0 only exists if you deny the scale of the problem. The second thing is, if you want to help the work in the Philippines, go to Angolese Relief, Margaret Simon's charity, and donate money to that. If you're Australian, that's got deductible gift recipient status, so you can get a tax deduction. If you're in other countries, consider donating to Hear Their Cries, which is my charity. Go to heartheircries.org, hearing the cries of victims and whistleblowers. That's a 501c3, so it's got tax deductible status in the United States, and we're just going through a charity commission process in the Charity Commission. But I think the most important thing that all of your listeners can do, even if they are unwilling or uninterested in donating, is just be aware. Be aware that this goes on, because awareness is the first issue. Don't deny, don't hide from it. Before we leaked the Oxfam scandal, which was the Oxfam staff who were abusing women and children in Haiti, I was talking with a journalist from the Sunday Times, and she said to me, and I'm glad it was a female journalist, she said to me, this issue comes up every now and again, but never gets traction. Why doesn't it get traction? And I said to her, well, you're the journalist. You tell me why it doesn't get traction. And she said, I hate to say this, but abuse happens to little black girls in Africa, and people don't care about little black girls in Africa. And that's true. And when we leaked the Oxfam scandal, part of the narrative that we leaked was the anger at the misuse of funds. And the people got most angry at the misuse of funds, not the misuse of the women. As sad as it is to say, it is that abuse of funds. So I would say to people, the thing you can do first is be aware of it. Don't turn away. Don't be a person who doesn't care about little black girls in Africa. Do care. It does matter. Don't deny it. I know that sex abuse of women and children is a very difficult subject. Do not turn away from it. If you turn away from the subject, you create the space in which abusers can act with impunity. Be aware. That's the most important thing.
And for our listeners, most of which are people who travel with us and travel the world, awareness is key. So please keep that in mind. And for anyone,
and we've seen the creeps. We've all seen the creeps. We've probably been on a tour with one or two of them.
Yes, and there's the adage, of course, if you see something, say something.
Call it out.
And so for anybody who's listening to this and they're thinking, wow, Andrew should write a book. Well, in fact, he's written quite a few. So your best-known book, A Life Half Lived, reflects on your time working in humanitarian crises and in conflict zones. So what was it exactly that made you sit down and, you said, okay, I'm going to share these experiences? Because I think that was 2013, right?
Yeah, it was written in 2011 and published in 2013, so it desperately needs an up. I was working for an organisation called Committee for Melbourne at the time, and I was giving a speech somewhere. And this woman came up to me afterwards and said, oh, you got a lot of stories. You could write a book. And I'm like, yeah, maybe one day. She said, do you have a book agent? I said, no, maybe one day means maybe one day. And she's like, well, I'm a book agent. Handed me her card and she said, give me a first draft in 6 weeks. So I thought, told all my family and friends, righto, every night after work, every weekend, I'm out for the next 6 weeks. I'm going to spit out the first draft of this book. And the first draft I wrote in 6 weeks.
Wow. Okay. And how long was your first draft?
220,000 words. And the editorial process takes a long time. So we brought 220,000 words down to, I think it's about 80,000 words, the final version of the book. And it is a really laborious process about what stays in, what goes out. Have you said anything that could make you liable to being sued? All these sorts of things need to go through the process, through your mind. I do want to write another book. I've got to get her to agree. So through the process in Philippines, there's one child who's been abandoned by both mother and father. And a few years ago when she was 13, she put her hand in mine and said, I wish you were my daddy. And I said, I wish I was your daddy too. None of this would be happening. About a year after that, she said, no, I want you to be my daddy. And because her biological father was Australian, we got her dual nationality. So I'm now her informal foster father, and we've decided that when she turns 18 next year, we're going to go through the process of what's called adult adoption, which is a lot easier than doing it when she's a child because all she needs to do is consent. I want to write a book with her where she writes one chapter, I write one. And she's got to agree to this and write the story of how I found my daddy and how I found my daughter because she's an amazing kid. She's got an awesome strength. And I keep saying to her, you have no idea how powerful you are. And it's about letting her see that power, letting it flower, and then giving her the education and the options to choose for herself what she wants to do in her life. And it's a really strong story.
That's a great idea for a book and a follow-up. How many books have you written? Because you've also got Things I Would Have Told My Mother, Doing Good by My Mistake.
Yeah. And Maria. Maria is a book about a refugee child. It's the character Maria, it's fictionalized because the main character Maria, every story in the book is true, but it happened to 3 kids, and I combined the events happening to one child. And long story short, a Serbian child caught up in the great refugee movements during Operation Flash and Storm at the end of Bosnia, ended up in this orphanage run by Gordana. And the main child, what the story is based on, so many terrible things happened to her during that journey that by the time she got to the orphanage, she had totally mentally shut down, didn't laugh, didn't cry, didn't speak, just sat in the corner and ate food. And I tried to reach out to her during a few visits over a few months and nothing could get through. And during all of this, we were building a summer camp for the orphans through the money that Gordana was raising and a little bit that I was able to fund. And when we finally got this summer camp built, we were having a bonfire one night and the kids were all cooking marshmallows and laughing and crying, except Maria was just sitting off on her own. And I was just sitting down on a log next to the fire, and out of the blue, Maria walked up, sat down next to me, put her head on my shoulder and just started to cry. And when she opened up and told us what had happened to her, it was a really terrible story. And it doesn't end well. She ended up drowning in circumstances that were never fully explained to me. But I wrote that book in one sitting as a therapy to get over what happened to her, which, as you can tell in my voice, I never really have. Some really terrible things happen, but some really good things happen too.
Of your works, where would you recommend our readers begin if they were going to start with one of your books?
I'll wait till I write another one. I think A Life Half Lived is out of print now. I've written these books more for myself, not necessarily to publish them or to sell them. I find them good therapy. And I've also done a lot of home videos. Most of the countries I've visited now have a home video. And if you go to my YouTube channel, just Andrew MacLeod Travel, and there's 180 or 190 little home videos from most of the countries, including some that I've been with YPT on. So in most cases, if you're thinking about going to a country, go to my YouTube and have a look at what I thought about it. I don't market it. I don't monetize it in any way. It's just for a bit of fun. I think you're probably inspiring me to actually get off my rear end and write another book. And I think that's the one that needs to be written. I think that newspaper article about lessons from every country in the world, expanding that to a book is probably what I need to do next.
And let's talk about some of those travel stories that you have in the article. So in the article, you talked about meeting a young girl in Tuvalu, which is a place I've been in many times as YPT's Pacific tour manager. I'll be there next month. And it is, in this context that we're going to talk about, it is one of the things that I think is very meaningful about our least visited countries tour is going to these places, in particular, Kiribati and Tuvalu, two of the countries that we visit on that tour that are probably the most threatened by global climate change in the Pacific region. And it's really striking when you see how precarious their situation is. You have in Tuvalu where they are doing a fair amount of land reclamation projects to try to actually be proactive in this situation. And then you have Kiribati, a completely different situation where no one's really doing anything. You have the current president saying, well, if it's God's will, we'll build a new ark or something like that. And you go to the highest point and, when we do that, a lot of times with tourists, people laugh because it's awkward. But I think at that moment, they have the realization when they see the highest point in Tarawa is 3 meters. Yeah. And you see just how dire that situation is. So you met a girl in Tuvalu and she told you she wanted to grow up to be a climate warrior to save her country. Yeah. Even though Australia has made it very easy for citizens of Tuvalu to move to Australia, she told you she didn't want to do that, right?
Yeah, so just to give the context, I was doing some B-roll shooting for a teaser for a documentary company, the same company that did a documentary on the work in the Philippines. And if your listeners are in Australia, Google ABC Four Corners Sex Tourism, My Father's Secret. You can see a whole episode of Four Corners on the work we did. So I was doing some preliminary shooting in partnership with the Tuvalu Red Cross, and they got the kids together for us. And you can see this on my YouTube channel. So if you go to the Tuvalu video, it's there. And interviewing kids ranging in age from about 11 to about 15. What do they see about the threat of climate change? Because Tuvalu is doing a couple of things interesting. The first one is, in most parts of Tuvalu, you can throw a stone from one side of the country to another. It's a very long, thin series of atolls. And as I say in the film, in Tuvalu, there is nowhere to hide from climate change because there's not. Tuvalu is also creating a digital copy of itself and uploading it to the cloud. It's history, culture, dances, people, things like this. So when the country goes underwater, there is a historical claim. And what they're also doing, which is legally quite clever, is they are maintaining their assertion of the fishing rights and sea rights for when the country goes underwater. Because fishing rights in exclusive economic zone normally depend on where your coastline is. And they're saying, we want to keep those rights even when the coastline goes underwater. And you think, who's going to agree to that? And the answer is almost every country that has a coast, because they're going to want to do the same thing. So Tuvalu is actually quite innovative in the way they're dealing with the catastrophe of them going underwater. But then the kids were saying, this kid you mentioned, particularly Australia, is giving a certain number of visas each year, which over the next 50 years will mean that every single Tuvaluan could make it to Australia if they wanted to. And I asked this kid, what do you want to do in life? And she said, I want to be a climate warrior. And I'm just like, what an awesome kid. And I said, but, if Tuvalu goes underwater, will you go to New Zealand or Australia? She said, no. Tuvalu is my mother. I will just keep swimming. And it brings home the challenge of what do you do? And people my age, I turned 60 this year, I view our life now is all about empowering that generation to take over the leadership of humanity. I will say, just in case anyone is feeling catastrophized by it, I actually have a fairly optimistic view that 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, was by most quality of life indicators the best year in human history. We had the highest primary school completion rate, highest secondary school completion rate, highest university entrances, highest access to electricity, highest access to drinkable water, lowest infant mortality, lowest maternal mortality in human history. And population growth is coming under control as well. Because when you track population growth, the correlation between population growth curves coming down and women and girls' education curves going up is almost directly inverse. So the more you educate women and girls, the more population growth comes under control. So if you say the last full year before the pandemic, most quality of life indicators pointed to human beings actually having the best quality of life the globe has ever had. So let's start from a sense of optimism and positivity. Do we have a challenge about climate change? Yes, we do. Do we need to work to both reduce and ameliorate the consequences of climate change? Yes, we do. Will there be some losers in that? And will Tuvalu probably be a loser? Yes, probably. Is that a good thing? No, but we need to work together on that. So we need to look at the next generation like that young girl in Tuvalu who would now be 14 or 15, however long ago it was I was in Tuvalu. Maybe she'd be 13 or 14. I want to be a climate warrior. Well, you go, girl. Let's give you the education to do that. Tuvalu is my mother. Okay, well, let's see what we can do to protect Tuvalu. But let's also recognize in the horrific case that if it doesn't, Tuvalu does go underwater, yes, protect their history and culture online. Yes, let them have the fishing rights and the seabed rights for what was their coastline. There's a lot of challenges and things that we need to work around, and a little country like Tuvalu is actually at the global cutting edge of the thinking about what we do as a consequence.
Absolutely. And the people there are resilient and resourceful. And
yeah, they are.
We're going to keep bringing people there and hopefully spreading awareness about their situation.
Look at my video. And there's a 13-year-old boy, and he gave a very nuanced view that could have come out of the mouth of a 30-year-old. They're very, very consciously aware.
And where can people see your YouTube channel again? What's the name?
Just go Andrew MacLeod YouTube. It'll come up. Andrew MacLeod YouTube.
Okay.
Travel.
Andrew MacLeod.
You'll find me. I'll put a link on this podcast description.
Yes, we will. And you visited North Korea, and we have now. If we were doing this podcast, before the pandemic, we would have had a lot more of our listeners who'd probably been. But now we've got a lot of people who are waiting to go. So you, in your article, you described this striking metaphor. You said that the experience that North Koreans have is like telling someone their whole life that the best car in the world is a Ferrari, even though they've never seen another car. And then you've given them a Volkswagen Beetle and tell them it's a Ferrari and they believe it. So what kind of experiences did you have in North Korea that led you to make that metaphor?
So North Korea is impressive, not in the positive sense, but in that it leaves a strong impression on you. human beings can only have choice if you have two or more competing pieces of information to choose from. If you have only one piece of information, you will believe it, especially if it comes from an apparent authority. So the people of North Korea have one piece of information, and it is absolutely overwhelmingly powerful to see just how much the North Korean government controls every single piece of information that gets to their people. They don't have the internet, they don't have television, and they have a punishment system in North Korea where if you do something wrong, they punish 3 generations. If you're a child, they'll punish your parents and your grandparents. If you're a parent, they'll punish your children and your parents. If you're a grandparent, they'll punish your children and your grandchildren. So there is a real fear of don't do anything wrong and believe what you're told by the state. So they believe they're in a good country. And it really is impressive. And that's why I give that analogy. It's like, how can people who have not been to North Korea understand that? You know, you have never seen a car, but you're told the Ferrari is the best car. Then someone gives you a Volkswagen Beetle and tells you it's a Ferrari. You're going to believe it's a Ferrari. You now believe you're driving the best car in the world. And the people in North Korea believe that they're in the best country. One of my guides was telling me about the food queues in Melbourne. And when he was describing the photo he saw, it wasn't a food queue. It was the Melbourne Cricket Ground on grand final day. And it was the queues outside the Melbourne Cricket Ground. But if you're given a photo and you're shown it's something else, then you believe it. And we're victims of that as well. Like during the Syrian refugee crisis, a friend of mine's wife posted on her Facebook a picture of a ship, and I've just forgotten its name, overflowing with refugees, saying, isn't it terrible, all these refugees coming from Syria? And I'm like, I have seen that photo somewhere before. I think it was called the Vlad, the ship, I think. And I said, oh, yeah, I've seen that before. That was the Albanian refugees fleeing Albania when Albania collapsed in 1996 or 7 or something.
Coming to Italy.
And I went back to her, from Bar to Bari, or Bari to Bar. I always get those two mixed up. And I sent her a copy of the original newspaper article with the original photo from the 1990s and said, look, we might disagree on refugees, but just be aware that photo you posted is factually wrong. It didn't come from Syrian refugees. It came from the Albanian refugee crisis. Here's the original photo and the original newspaper article from the time. And she replied, I will choose to believe the facts that I believe. Yes, surprisingly, we've had very, very few interactions since then because I said to her, I was in Montenegro at the time. You know, it's not something that was bullshit at the time. I remembered it from the time that it happened. And I'm now giving you objective proof that simply what the photo you posted was wrong. And I wasn't saying change your views on refugees. I was just saying, just take that photo down. No, I will believe the facts that I choose to believe. There are some people that believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. So, you know, if you think, wow, how could that possibly happen in North Korea? How could someone believe a Volkswagen is a Ferrari? Well, just look at what some people believe in our countries when we actually have alternative information from which to choose, but we choose not to. And the algorithms feed us just confirmation bias, which coming back to you know, the theme of this podcast about visiting every single country in the world, visiting every country and traveling with people like YPT, what it does is it forces you to open your mind and look at things from another perspective. And that is the most empowering thing that travel can do for you as an individual, which coming back to something I said right at the start, which is why I really feel sorry for the Insta-idiots who take a photo of an airport or a border post and say, I've visited a country, or take a big tour bus around Sydney and say, I've visited Australia. You've actually missed out on what travel does for you. It opens your mind and forces you to learn.
Our company slogan is, we take you to places your mother wishes you stayed away from. And that's why we go to places like North Korea, or that's why we went to Syria even under Assad. And then some people wrongly accuse us of being supporters of those governments. And While we do build contacts and relationships, it does not necessarily mean that we are supporters of those governments, but it's that we want to make these places, while they may be taboo, we want to make them accessible to people so that they can draw their own conclusions and opinions.
And it works the other way as well. Like when I was in North Korea, I had a guide. I won't mention her name for reasons that'll become clear. Lovely person. In any other circumstance, I think she and I would have stayed friends. We would have written to each other. We would have emailed each other. Like my friend Vika I met in Moscow in 92. I'd still be friends to this day. And at the end of the tour, before we went to the train station in the hotel we all stay in, she'd grab me and push me down some stairs and push me in a corner. I'm like, what's going on? She's like, this is the only part of the hotel that's not covered by camera, and I just wanted to say goodbye. And she will always know that the propaganda she's been told is not right. But she will also know, for her own safety and security, and that she can't say that. But the more people that know that North Korea is built on a lie inside North Korea, the better it is for the day that comes, whenever it might be, that North Korea changes. And I don't see that happening in the short or medium term. And there'll be a great challenge. There can't be a Gorbachev in North Korea. The average North Korean is 5 centimeters shorter than the average South Korean. And given that their genetics is more or less the same, that can only be explained by nutrition. And the North Korean leaders would look at people like Ceausescu when Romania fell. They swung from a bridge on a piano wire. And if tomorrow the border between North and South Korea was pulled down, the first thing the North Koreans would learn is that they were sold a lie and everything they believed was false. And they would go and take out revenge on their former leaders, even one who opened up the country, and those former leaders would swing on a piano wire from a bridge like Ceausescu did. And there is no hope, none, zero, of a reform of North Korea that comes from internal to North Korea. It can only happen from external to North Korea, and that is most likely, even in a very, very remote case, that is most likely to come from China, not South Korea. Many commentators, and as well as a visiting professor at genetics, I'm a visiting professor of war and conflict studies at King's. And one of the things that's very clear, the lesson that people like Kim Jong-un has taken from the collapse of Libya is give up your nuclear weapons at your peril.
And the current situation that we're experiencing with Iran.
That's right. And if I were Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump offered to negotiate, I'd be very, very nervous. And let's be clear, I would never vote for Donald Trump. But Einstein's definition of insanity is doing something the same way, expecting a different result. And maybe we need a different type of diplomacy in some areas of international affairs. It'll be interesting to see if the change in leadership in Venezuela leads to a change in Venezuela. The early signs are looking relatively positive. One of the consequences of the conflict in the Middle East in the last couple of weeks, and by that I mean the Middle East and Persia, because of course Iran is not part of the Middle East, but Iranian response has totally unified the Arabian countries. A few years ago, Saudi and Qatar had a dispute. 2 days ago, I was flying out of Tabuk, and Qatari jets were on in the hangars in Tabuk in Saudi. So the Qataris and the Saudis have agreed that the Qataris can hide some of their air force in Saudi from the Iranians. So you just say that's a radical shift in the relationship between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which is a good thing. So it'll be very interesting to see how geopolitics unfolds in the next little while. It's too easy to protest against the Americans and too easy to protest against Donald Trump. When you're protesting against something, you are by definition protesting for the opposite. So when you're protesting against Donald Trump in Iran, you're by definition protesting for, whether you like it or not, keeping the mullahs in power. And there's no one outside the mullahs themselves that wish they stayed in power in Iran. And I have Iranian family, and the Iranian people are wonderful. And, the experiences I had in Iran were a lot of fun. And like a lot of countries in the world that are living under totalitarian, dictatorial or repressive regimes, the people are still wonderful people. And you can have a laugh and a good meal and a great chat, except in North Korea, with the people. So maybe we do need a different approach. And as we're seeing the return of dominance of China and India and the relative decline of the United States, and the world is a little destabilized at the moment, we've got to have a sense of optimism and positivity to try and find the paths that give to that 11-year-old girl in Tuvalu a little bit of hope for her future as our generation fades and passes into irrelevance. And I like to say at my time in life, about to hit 60, we're on the slow drift to obscurity, and we have to be happy about it. And how we hand over our lessons and our experiences in life to the next generation is the critical thing that drives our legacy.
Now, why do you think some of these totalitarian governments, like North Korea or Iran, get all the coverage over others that are very similar, such as a Turkmenistan or Eritrea, which I like to call DPRK 2.0 type countries?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
So the media has a thing called the doctrine of proximity. The closer something is to you, either physically or intellectually, the bigger news it is. In a local newspaper in South Melbourne, my suburb in Australia, someone being hit by a car will be front page news, even if they're only injured, in the local newspaper. That, of course, has no hope of reaching the Sunday Times. So for an international event to be of news in your home country, it's got to be a large international event that has a proximity to you either intellectually or geographically. So something in New Zealand only needs to be comparatively small to make the news in Australia, but it needs to be a lot bigger to make the news in France. So you look at the Middle East. The Middle East has a proximity by its impact on our economies through oil price shocks, and a proximity through de facto consequences like terrorism in London, Spain, New York, Bondi Beach. So even something that is geographically non-proximate is intellectually proximate because of perceived consequences that could happen to us or our people, however we define us. There is no proximity for most people in Australia when thinking about Eritrea or Sudan. Let me dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
Because I've drawn the comparator between the coverage of Gaza and the coverage in Sudan a little while ago. There are, for me, 5 reasons to protest Gaza but not protest Sudan. And those 5 reasons are these. A, you're Palestinian and it's personal. Fair enough. I totally get it. Not just Muslim, but Palestinian, because, of course, people dying in Sudan are Islamic as well. Second is racism. You actually don't care about the black lives in Sudan. Those black lives don't matter. Thirdly is anti-Semitism. You don't like the killing is being done by Israel. It's not the victims that worry you, it's the perpetrator. The fourth reason is naivety. You're just not aware of Sudan. The fifth reason is something else that I haven't thought of. So if you are protesting Gaza but not protesting Sudan with the same amount of passion, given that more people are dying in Sudan, more children are dying in Sudan, there's more brutality in Sudan than in Gaza. So my question to you is, are you Palestinian? Are you racist? Are you anti-Semitic? Are you naive? Or is there just something else? In other words, I'm calling bluff on proximity, because the people who say they're protesting Gaza because I'm just worried about humanity, bullshit. If you're not protesting Sudan, I'm supporting Muslims, bullshit. If you're not protesting Sudan, I don't like seeing children die, bullshit. If you're not protesting Sudan, unless you don't see Sudan. And why are you not seeing Sudan? Is it because you're naive, because you're willfully blind, or because the media is not feeding it to you? And why is the media not feeding it to you? Because it doesn't reach the doctrine of proximity, or you don't care about black people, or you're really angry at the Jewish government, at the Israeli government. They are the reasons, and they're very uncomfortable reasons. And most people respond, well, I'm not Palestinian, but I'm not racist, but I'm not naive, and I'm not anti-Semitic. Oh, really? Then why aren't you protesting Sudan with the same vigor that you're protesting Gaza? I'm not saying don't protest Gaza. I'm not defending the actions of the Israeli government. Let's be very, very clear. But I am saying over 20 years ago, I wrote a report that said there's genocide taking place in Darfur, and it's still happening, and no one is protesting.
and it's important to look at all of these things equally.
Yes.
That kind of brings me to, we've been talking about a lot of very heavy, very deep things tonight, and I think a lot of things that are wrong in the world, but we are coming on my final questions, and one of my final questions, and I think I know the answer, so despite the fact that we're talking about things that we think are wrong, I want to ask you, are you optimistic or pessimistic about humanity's future?
I'm very optimistic, with an asterisk. You know, we are the first species smart enough to wipe ourselves out. Question, are we smart enough not to? And that's going to be a challenge for future generations. I'm very optimistic because I see a lot of very fast change. I'm now chief of staff at a university here in Saudi Arabia, and I see some of the most incredible research being done on photovoltaic, dry crop farming, water desalination, sustainable energy generation and usage. So there's plenty of research and ideas that exist, and humanity has proven over and over and over again that it can invent new ideas, particularly when faced with a catastrophe. But we've also proven over and over again, sometimes we need to go through the catastrophe before we come out the other side. I think there are positives and negatives on the global communication platforms. The fact that, you know, I used to have to write a letter to Vicar, but now I can have a video conference for free. The fact that you and I can do this podcast, you're in Philippines, I'm in Saudi Arabia, and we're video chatting for free. I remember having to book an international phone call in 1981 to speak to my aunt in London at Christmas time. I remember in 1990, in the mid-1990s, huddling around the shortwave radio, listening to BBC in Rwanda, getting a little glimpse of news and coming back to Australia and not knowing who the Prime Minister is. And now I read the newspaper the day before. But the downside of the global communication is hate spreads faster than love. And we have a challenge to make sure love wins over hate. And the last 20 years, the experiment of social media, which has destroyed an entire generation and created a very, very unhappy and destabilized generation. And anyone who disbelieves that, there are two books you should read, Anxious Generation and Bad Therapy, to have a look at the impact of two twin evils. One is social media that has positive sides as well, and the other is the overdiagnosis of mental conditions on young people, that we're no longer empowering our young people in our cultures to succeed. We're giving them reasons to fail, but that's in our cultures. When I then come to countries like this one, and I see the enthusiasm and the optimism, particularly amongst young women, that there is a real hope for humanity. And I note your question was hope for humanity, not necessarily hope for our cultures. And people love to talk about rise of China and India, and they look at economic graphs going back to 1980 and show how the West is coming down and the East is coming up. And I say, take that graph back to the birth of Jesus Christ, and you find that Western cultures have dominated for about 27% of the time, but it's just the last 27%. So it's not that Eastern cultures are rising, they're returning. And we have the assumption that Western cultures are the natural form of governance, military and economics in the world. Truth is, we're not the natural form, we're the spike. You know, we're returning back to other cultures having a stronger influence in global governance. And there are some things in that we can be concerned about, but some things we should be optimistic for. In general terms, Asian cultures are a lot more collective, a lot more worried about family and community than Western cultures are. Western cultures tend to be a lot more individualistic. But you cannot solve climate change from an individualistic perspective. You have to solve it from a collective perspective. So maybe the rise of Asian cultures and Eastern cultures is what humanity needs to solve the climate change issue. Maybe. So I'm very positive. There is no saying you can't plan for the status quo. There is no such thing as finishing reform. Reform is an ongoing basis. In Australia, I like to say Australia has no major challenges, but we have ongoing fine-tuning that is required of our political, economic and social systems. There are major changes that are happening internationally that will result in winners and losers, that will result in challenges. I'm generally pretty optimistic because myself, while I love Australia and I see myself as an Australian, I very much see myself as a human being as well. And having been to every country in the world and lived in many of them and lived in many difficult circumstances, I know for me, I can adjust and I can adapt to whatever the world brings forward. And what I would like to do is take whatever knowledge I have in that ability to adapt and change and see the positive and listen to understand, not listen to argue, and transmit that to as many people as I can so that as many people as possible are as well armed as possible for the challenges and the changes that inevitably come.
And finally, now that you have visited every country in the world, where are you drawn back to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know there are some countries I don't want to go back to because they were just really difficult. I think now it's about visiting people rather than places. Three sisters in Belgium I've known since the 90s. They feel like my sisters and their family feels like mine. I haven't seen them enough and got to know their kids enough. I want to go back and spend more time with them. And my friends in Luxembourg and Spain, I want to go and see them. I love Lake Bled in Ljubljana and the comfort and serenity you get from that country. My friends in Australia, of course, I love the nature of Botswana and Namibia, and I'd love to go back to them again. I want to go back to Pakistan 20 years after the earthquake and see how the reconstruction has evolved. I went back to Rwanda and Bosnia in 2016 to see how the peace is stabilizing. I'm optimistic for Rwanda, pessimistic for Bosnia. But, you know, the water rescue program we set up in Yugoslavia with the Yugoslav national swim team at the time, when I went back in 2017, we had a dinner with everyone there. And we all talked about how our lives have been over those intervening decades. And that's the sort of stuff that I want to do, go back and see the people and meet their kids. And, you know, I've got my 60th birthday coming up in November and we're going to do it in Singapore. And I want my friends from all around the world to come and meet each other because they never have. And more importantly, have their children meet each other and create that next generation of a global network to build out the future in optimism. That's what I want to do. And I want to drift into obscurity and be happy about it.
And that's great that you want to share your experiences through, in person, with the network that you have, through your publications and through doing podcasts like this. And we appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspectives on your humanitarian work, on geopolitics, on international institutions, on everything that you've been doing with both our listeners and the YPT team as well. And there's a lot to keep in mind as we travel, either on our own or with a travel agency like YPT, going to places your mother wishes you'd stayed away from. And my final question to you, Andrew, is there any truth to the rumor that you might one day run for Prime Minister of Australia?
No. I did run for Parliament once in the 2001 federal election and lost because of September 11. We lost by a handful of votes, but well too old now. As I said a couple of times, I'm turning 60 soon. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of the UK, is a year or so younger than me. Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, is a year or two older than me. There's
well,
a lot
in the
of my
US,
peers
all of our leaders are like 80, so you'd be right in your prime.
I know you need to get that changed, but there's a difference between a presidential and a parliamentary style. So, like as Macron proved in France or Donald Trump in the United States, you can come out of the blue and become president. Whereas in a parliamentary system, you need to win a seat, get in Parliament, earn your stripes as a minister, then spend some time in opposition, become opposition leader, then become Prime Minister. In a best case scenario, I come out of the left of politics. Anthony Albanese is the Prime Minister of Australia at the moment. I would need to run at the next election and win a seat, but it would need to be a safe seat because I would then need to be in Parliament when Labor lost. I would then need to do time in opposition and build my record up as a shadow minister, probably 2 or 3 terms. So you're looking at the last term of government, 2 more years, 2 or 3 more terms, 6 to 9 years. So you're then looking at 11 years, and then you need to win and assume that you'd be leader. So you're talking about being, 71, 72, minimum, if everything goes right. And that's not going to happen. And more importantly, I have an expression, it's amazing how much you can get done so long as you let someone else take the credit. So what I prefer to do now is sit in the background and pull the little levers of power. And I do that quite effectively. through a number of things that I do. My fingerprints are on stuff, but my name's not on it. And I'm happy with that.
All right. I feel like we could talk for 2, 4, 6 hours and turn this into a multi-part podcast series, but maybe we will, in fact, do that at some point. But that is it for this episode. So, Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
I'm Justin Martell, and this has been another episode of the Young Pioneer Podcast.